The National Electrical Code, or NEC, addresses the handling of abandoned cables. Regarding the questions about the NEC 2005 and its provisions for abandoned communications cable, optical fiber, coaxial cable, and network-powered broadband communications cable, firstly, it is correct that the NEC 2005 generally does not alter the abandoned cable provisions found in the NEC 2002. However, there is one notable exception to this rule. The NEC 2005 introduces an exception to Section 800.40 ATWO. This exception allows abandoned communications cables to remain in place under specific conditions. These conditions are that the presence of the abandoned cables does not pose a hazard to people or property. Additionally, these cables must not interfere with the normal operation of the electrical system. If these conditions are met, the abandoned cables can be left without needing to be removed. Secondly, the observation about the deletion of Section 830.55b from the NEC 2002 and the NEC 2005 is also correct. Section 830.55b in the NEC 2002 specifically provided guidelines for the removal of network-powered broadband communications cable. The NEC 2005 removes this section, and as a result, Article 830 in the NEC 2005 includes a definition for abandoned network-powered broadband communications cable. However, it lacks specific provisions detailing how to remove such cable. The precise reason for removing Section 830.55b is not explicitly stated within the NEC 2005 document itself. There is a possible explanation, though. It is conceivable that the NEC committee responsible for updating the code believed that the existing requirements for removing abandoned cables, as outlined in Section 800.40, were adequately comprehensive. In other words, they might have felt that the general requirements in Section 800.40 sufficiently covered all categories of abandoned cables, including network-powered broadband communications cables, and therefore a specific section for network-powered broadband communications cables was deemed unnecessary. To elaborate further on Section 800.40 ATWO, it's important to understand its context within the broader framework of communications circuits. Article 800 in the NEC covers communications circuits, and these circuits encompass a wide array of wiring systems used for transmitting signals for various purposes. This includes telephone, data, audio, and video communications. Section 800.40 specifically addresses the installation of communications wires, cables, and equipment. The abandoned cable provisions within this section are designed to mitigate potential safety hazards that can arise when cables are no longer in use but remain in place within buildings. Abandoned cables can pose a fire risk. The materials used in cable construction, particularly older cable types, can be combustible and contribute to the spread of fire. Abandoned cables can also add to the overall fire load within a building, increasing the intensity and duration of a fire. Abandoned cables can impede access for firefighters. Bundles of abandoned cables can obstruct pathways and create entanglement hazards, making it difficult for firefighters to navigate a building during an emergency. Abandoned cables can contribute to the spread of smoke and toxic fumes. The insulation and jacketing materials in cables can release harmful substances when burned, posing a health risk to occupants and firefighters. Abandoned cables can create confusion for technicians. When new wiring is installed, it can be difficult to differentiate between active and abandoned cables, leading to potential errors and safety hazards. The exception to Section 800.40 ATWO in the NEC 2005 provides a degree of flexibility in situations where the removal of abandoned cables would be impractical or excessively costly. However, it's crucial to carefully assess the potential risks before invoking this exception. A qualified electrical engineer or other knowledgeable professional should evaluate the specific circumstances to ensure that leaving the cables in place does not compromise safety or create operational problems. The reference to Article 830 and the removal of Section 830.55b brings up the topic of network-powered broadband communications systems. Article 830 of the NEC covers these systems, which deliver broadband services such as internet, television, and telephone over a network-powered infrastructure. These systems often utilize coaxial cable or optical fiber as the transmission medium. Section 830.55 in the NEC 2002 addressed the specific requirements for abandoned network-powered broadband communications cable. Subsection B of this section mandated the removal of such cable when it was no longer in use. The deletion of this subsection in the NEC 2005 raises questions about the rationale behind the change. As previously mentioned, one possible explanation is that the NEC committee believed that the general abandoned cable requirements in section 800.40 were sufficient. However, another possibility is that the committee recognized the practical challenges associated with removing large quantities of abandoned network-powered broadband communications cable in existing buildings. Removing these cables can be disruptive, time-consuming, and expensive. In some cases, it may be difficult to access the cables without causing damage to the building structure or other wiring systems. Regardless of the reason for the deletion, it's important to note that the definition of abandoned network-powered broadband communications cable remains in Article 830 of the NEC 2005. This definition clarifies what constitutes abandoned cable in the context of network-powered broadband communications systems. The definition is important because it helps to determine which cables are subject to the abandoned cable requirements in section 800.40. In summary, the NEC 2005 introduces a minor change to the abandoned cable provisions in section 800.40 outward by adding an exception that allows abandoned communications cables to remain in place under certain conditions. At the same time, the NEC 2005 deletes section 830.55b, which previously mandated the removal of abandoned network-powered broadband communications cable. The reasoning behind this deletion is not explicitly stated, but it may be related to a belief that the general abandoned cable requirements in section 800.40 are sufficient, or a recognition of the practical challenges associated with removing large quantities of abandoned network-powered broadband communications cable.